So it all balances out. Thank you so
All
much
balances.
for that. And as we know, you will be part of our panelists. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, if you're a first-time home buyer, please put all your questions in the chat box right now. Justin will be joining us later in order for you guys to have any questions that you have. Put them all in the chat box. I want to see all of the questions, everything. There's no such thing as a dumb question. Right? This is a safe space. So up next, ladies and gentlemen, we have a combined conglomerate, which is Intergen and Bruno Samau attorneys, and that would be Shilly Boy and Bruno Samau, but they are joined by Lisa and Bruce. So gentlemen and lady, how are you this evening?
Hi, Kali.
Hi, how are you?
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Hi, Bruce.
Hello, hello, hello. Happy New Year to you too. Hope
Happy New Year to you.
2022.
Hi, Shilly Boy.
Hi, Kali. Hi. You're Andrew tonight.
Yes, as always. Okay, and is that everybody? Because I understood that Lisa is also going to be joining us.
Hi, it seems my camera just doesn't want to switch on.
Okay, no problem. I will leave it up to you, lady and gentlemen.
Thank you so much.
Lisa, how's your microphone doing?
Can you guys hear me? Is it fine?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, yes. So we decided to take a bit of more of like a practical approach to this and really just look into the influx of the demand for student accommodation, but also from the perspective of a lot of you who are property developers and agents, and really looking into expanding your portfolios and going into student accommodation and factors that you should consider when looking into student accommodation. And something that you might not have considered is the difference between residential accommodation and commercial accommodation and the impact that might have on you as a supplier of these services. So one thing that a lot of you, I think, haven't considered is the VAT implications that you might incur when providing student accommodation. And that is because residential accommodation is VAT exempt. So you've never really thought about any of the VAT implications. But when it comes to student accommodation, which falls under commercial accommodation based of the definition, which is when you provide services that include lodging and boarding, and you provide domestic services such as water, electricity, and things like that. So we looked at a case which will help the practical viewpoint of this. And there was a development company that provided fully furnished units to a tertiary institution. And they entered into a 5-year lease agreement with this tertiary institution, and they went on to provide these fully furnished units to the students. And so the property developers, they contended that they should be able to claim the exemption of only having to pay VAT on 60% of the fees of the charges that they incurred when providing these services. But then they were like, well, you guys don't classify as commercial accommodation service providers. And so the question was, why don't they? And this is when it's really important to consider the parties that you're contracting with. You have to take into account that every single step of a contract will have its own VAT implications. So if you're not leasing directly to a student and you're leasing rather to a juristic person, it would not be considered to be a commercial accommodation agreement because a juristic person cannot be considered lodging at your accommodation. And so when the development company was like, well, what does that mean for us? You have to consider that the end user might not be the contracting party. So you might not be able to apply for certain exemptions if you don't fully consider who you're contracting with and what VAT implications or even just tax implications that might have. And this can also lead to a downside for not only you, but as well as students, because a lot of developers might think, okay, well, I can't get the VAT input back. So they're going to try and increase those increase the prices that they charge for these rentals. But once again, that fee is capped at a commercial level. Whereas with a rental, you might be able to have more wiggle room and you might be able to charge more inflated prices. So I think it's really, really important that when you're going into these ventures of student accommodation, to really consider who you're going to contract with and what implications that might have on you.
Well, thanks so much, Lisa. Shilly boy, do you want to jump in there and clarify some of the practical aspects?
Yeah, look, I think maybe let's look at the practicality from the technical side of what Lisa has actually conveyed. So not to scare people. So I think that the practicality was that the contention of the issue here is about what is actually commercial accommodation. So that's actually what has been an issue of the court, from High Court to Supreme Court. And the argument that we find, and I think why we're having this conversation is because the reality is that at some point as a property investor, you might want to hedge where you are saying, listen, I don't want to deal with ordinary students. Actually, I would rather contract with UJ. I would rather contract with University of Pretoria or Stellenbosch University for that matter. But what are the implications for that kind of a relationship? And you making sure that you actually see this relationship independently, like what Lisa said. This part of agreement that you're going to have with particular institution, what are the tax implications and the legal implication from that standpoint of view, right? Is it a commercial accommodation? And I think this is where Lisa was saying, because if you look at the definition of commercial accommodation according to the VAT Act, it's basically indicating the referencing to the lodging and boarding and others, right? But the word that was part of contention for this case, that is, it's actually handed down in December, I think it was around December in Supreme Court of Appeal. It's about what is lodging. Can I, as Shilly boy, owning a specific property company and then having this student accommodation as a juristic person, as an entity, then contract myself with a university? Will I be considering to be providing a lodging, right? Can a juristic person be a lodger? So I think that was the merit of this case. So it was actually decided that actually a juristic person cannot actually be a lodger. The juristic person, rather, from legal contention point of view, can actually be what we call a lessee or lessor. That can be you can find a juristic person as an entity being there. So this is where in this case, it was found that if I'm providing, and I've got an agreement, say with UJ, I can't then come tomorrow and say, actually, I'm providing commercial accommodation, right? Because I'm not having that lodging principles with UJ, right? So this is where the reason why this individual actually wanted to push that they actually been classifying that agreement of providing this student accommodation as a commercial is because there's a provision within VAT Act that allows that should you be providing a commercial accommodation beyond the recurring 28 days, you can actually charge that output at 60% of what you're charging. If let's say your rate is 7,000 per 2-bedroom, you can actually have output VAT of 60% of that. The logic behind this, with this particular entity, what they were trying to achieve is to ensure, because if you think about it, I mean, the likes of Mlalo, he will probably attest to this. If you've got this massive building of student accommodation, you probably have a high value in terms of input VAT. So can you imagine if it can be classified that you're actually providing an exempt supply, which means that you will be restricted to claim that input VAT. What does it say according to your margins? it's going to that input VAT because you can't claim it. It's going to eat into your margins. You can agree with me with that. But if you are obviously providing the small scale of student, you might not see it. But if you start now building those 100 units, 200 units, and 300 and 1,000, 2,000 units, then it's starting to increase and eat into that margins. And what Lisa was saying, actually, from practical point of view, say, what will be the solution of what most property investors will typically do? If I see that I can't claim that input VAT, what are the chances that I'm not going to increase the fee that I have between UJ and myself? Then what happens? Then the student accommodation fees will probably be more expensive. Then we're most likely going to be a repeat of fees must fall. So those are the part of the contention of this case. So now what we're saying actually is saying within that commercial, guys, and I think just to clarify confusion that might happen, within that definition of this, what is this commercial accommodation? There's an exclusion, right? Once they define, then there's an exclusion which is applicable to you and I, who are actually providing dwelling as a residential accommodation and providing student accommodation, because it's saying that the moment you are entering into that letting and hiring of, then it's no longer meeting the definition of what you call commercial, which is where most of you guys who are sitting here are actually falling under, which means that you are still going to be in that position where you're actually still supplying what we call exempt supply. So that's what the difference. So this case, it's actually more relevant if now you're starting to change your market approach. You say, how do I go to the market as a student accommodation provider? Do I still deal with student one by one, or do I do B2B instead of B2C? If you get what I mean, your marketing strategy having to change. So you need to bear that in mind, because in your visibility, it's gonna eat in your margin. So you need to start actually worrying about that. Bruno, do you want to say something? Or Bruce?
Well, look, it was a very interesting case. I read it as one. There was a component also of how the university was utilizing the property, because they actually changed the nature of the utilization from a more longer term to a shorter term temporary accommodation, which is why there was an argument that this was more commercial versus just residential. But so the nice thing is, at the end of the day, exactly what Shitty Boy says, from our perspective here, this works. The SCA has confirmed that a supply of student accommodation under these circumstances does not comprise commercial accommodation, which means that it's VAT exempt. And it being VAT exempt, to a certain degree, makes a lot of sense, because it means that when you charge the rent, you don't need to make provision for VAT. The downside is when you start, like Shirley Boy mentioned, when you start building on larger scales and you start having a lot of VAT that you want to claim back, it then starts becoming a harder pill to swallow. But long term, this does make sense. So a lot of the clients that we deal with and that I've spoken to, when it comes to charging VAT on residential property, at least the prices are now kept in line, and you're not trying to charge a student what you need in your pocket plus what SARS needs in theirs.
Yeah, great, Bruno. And I think just to clarify also this, so the interesting part is that this particular entity, when they were contending and arguing their case, they tried to, let's put it this way. So UJ will have a relationship with students. You will agree with me, because then they'll provide that particular accommodation to students. Like Bruno was saying, is that during December, when students are actually vacating the premise, then those people who do research, university normally rent out those student accommodation during the December period and January period. So those short visits, so they had those type of agreement. So this particular entity, the student accommodation provider, actually I don't know who was advising them, clearly not Bruno. So, but what they did, they wanted to actually consolidate the whole arrangement, the agreement that the student, the UJ, I'm using UJ as an example, not necessarily that it's a UJ here. So UJ and having these particular students and UJ with the service provider. So they wanted to consolidate this, and so that they see it as actually one, and the one parcel, sort of a one agreement, and say, yes, because the end user is the student, therefore, and we are providing the lodging, because the reason being that if you are providing student accommodation and together with these other domestic services, I think that also the contention here is, what is this commercial accommodation? If you are providing dwelling, which is a typical residential units, together with what we classified as domestic services, you can agree with me, domestic services will be water and electricities, Wi-Fi's, you know, all these things that are domestic orientated. Therefore, then together with that will be the definition of commercial accommodation, right? So they use all the technicality. Unfortunately, it couldn't fly. So just be mindful out there, guys, especially as you building more and more, more portfolio. Bruce?
You know what occurs to me while we're actually discussing this VAT case is that it's rather important that what the property is used for and how it is used is properly defined and provided for in the agreement between the student accommodation provider and UJ in this example. That way you can actually try and avoid these sort of events taking place. And again, this speaks to more making sure that your agreement's in order, and with the incoming Property Practitioners Act, this is possibly the best time than ever to have a look at your agreements, just to make sure that they're all in order and the house is in order.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So being mindful of time, we're quickly going to jump to the second part that we want to discuss. I think we have about 10 minutes left. I did see a question in the Q&A just regarding the VAT implications for Airbnb. So typically this is like around the hotel type of accommodation. So VAT would be leviable in those circumstances. But I mean, we can always ask that question later in the evening, and we'll go into it in a bit more depth. But the off-the-cuff answer is Airbnb VAT is levied. Then, so the next interesting topic that I think is on everyone's minds, it's all over radio stations. A lot of people are phoning me to discuss it, is the Property Practitioners Act, and how this impacts us as investors, how this impacts us as property professionals, as property practitioners, as estate agents. And I think the array of questions is so vast because everyone is worried about the impact on them. And we've had to answer this question so subjectively that it's become very difficult to kind of have a one answer fits all type of scenario where this is how it works, there you go, like here's the answer, it's good or bad. So I suppose the first thing that I'm maybe going to touch on, and Bruce, you can comment on this, and then I'm going to bring Shirley Boy in on one of the points of contention that I have with this act. So maybe I'm just going to spend the first few minutes discussing the outline of the act. Bruce can comment, and then I'm going to bring Shirley Boy in on that contentious point. So first thing, after having read the act, a lot of the act is a replica of the Estate Agency Affairs Act. Now, not verbatim, and when I say replica, it's not word for word, it's drafted differently, but a lot of the control mechanism doesn't change the nature of what estate agents do. It just adds a few more obligations here and there to govern things from a consumer perspective. It changes the controlling body and how the controlling body is supposed to be run. I personally feel that changing the name of a body that already had issues in the past isn't going to fix the issues. It's patching it over and hoping that by giving it a different name, things are going to work better now. And I mean, so that is a point of concern that I have, but you can see in the act certain things, for example, like 3 years for the FFC as opposed to everyone having to apply every year. That's obviously going to release a lot of pressure, and there won't be such a backlog because obviously there's less applications, right? The training regime might be a bit stricter, but all in all, this act was pretty much drafted off the back of the Estate Agency Affairs Act, in my opinion, And then they said, well, it covers all these other professions. So you're looking at home inspectors, you're looking at bond originators, bond brokers, developers, a whole managing agents, a whole range of people that are now impacted by this act. Unfortunately, then, when the act came out, everyone was very confused because we didn't quite understand why these practitioners might need trust accounts, why a lot of the stuff had to do with estate agency work, but it apparently covered this huge profession. Waiting for the regulations, we waited. The regulations came out, and then all of a sudden they came and said, well, act's coming into effect on the 1st of February. So that's first thing, guys. 1st of February, act's coming out. So that's just something to think about now. So Bruce, maybe just briefly, do you have any quick insights into also your perception of the act before I quickly touch on how the act might impact the investors?
I agree 100% with you that there are definitely aspects of the act that haven't been given the necessary clarity. For instance, in case in point, as the topic of the evening is, student accommodations and developers of student accommodation. The act almost defined property practitioner with regard to what the person potentially could do, rather than what they do in the ordinary course of that person's business activities. And some of the definitions, yes, they do accord to that. But that being said, for instance, developers of student accommodation, why would they need a trust account? Why would they need a fidelity fund certificate? Sure. And also, why would the same requirements be imposed upon the likes of building inspectors, which seems rather extreme, to say the least.
Yeah.
But I can go on and on.
Yeah.
And
we've seen in the regulations that now they've tried to push back a little bit and create exceptions and the like, things that you'd normally find in the act itself. But there are certain things in the regulation, and a lot gets left for the authority itself to decide and to implement, which again begs the question where there's a lot of gray. We're not sure what's going to happen. Certain rules are in place. Certain rules we can anticipate how they're going to work from previous experience, and some things we just don't have a clue. Like, for example, how they plan to regulate the other property practitioners and what that actually means from an industry perspective, and whether there's going to be further exemptions if those property practitioners are already regulated by other more professional bodies. So from my perspective, especially in the SAPIN environment, I see two things. The one pitfall is what this means for sourcing agents, because a lot of the guys on this platform are out there looking for deals and investments. And number two, the tax clearance perspective for everyone, including estate agents. Now, so very quickly, I'm going to try to do it in like a couple of sentences. Sourcing agents, how does this impact? Number one, sourcing agents would technically be considered property practitioners, as they normally would be considered estate agents if they're brokering some sort of deal. As I've explained before in the past, the simple acquisition of information and passing it on to somebody else is very different to brokering or facilitating a deal. So, there is still a fine line there. But if you are considered to be brokering any sort of deal, guys, you have to be an estate agent, because in the past, people used to get away with charging COM up front, collecting it, and if there was an issue later, going, well, you can't claim it back from me because nothing made provision for the refund of commission. Now, under this act, the refund of commission is in place together with penalties, and it becoming a criminal offense to practice as a property practitioner whilst not being registered. Apologies. So be very careful. I think as a sourcing agent, where you're trying to broker deals, it has gotten to a point where this regulation has now more heavily regulated the industry, which means that you might have to go to what I've suggested in the past. And I mean, we don't have time to speak about it now, but whatever I said in the past, warning it, now we're going to need to take it one step further and actually implement those plans that I had discussed previously. The second issue is tax clearance. Apparently now, one cannot be a property practitioner or cannot get a Fidelity Fund certificate if they don't have the tax clearance certificate. So I just wanted to bring Shirley Boy in quickly, just for a brief discussion on what that actually means.
Thanks, Bruno. I mean, in the interest of time, I think for me is, I always say, that means that because SARS wants to have money, and the reality is that SARS went on a campaign to raise more revenue for the state, which is right thing to do. We can argue outside of this platform. But the reality is that it means, jokes aside, but it means that the record keeping of typically the sourcing agents is going to be crucial. The reality is that whoever pays you guys is going to claim those expenses one way or another. So SARS, one way or another, is going to have that information that you were paid. That's a reality, even if you try to sort of do it somehow. So one thing also is that make sure that your tax returns are up to date, because the reality is that if your tax returns are not submitted on time, then you're going to have non-compliance, which means that it's going to potentially affect your business, and we shouldn't find you in that position. But one of the interesting part with this, Bruno, is that it's most likely going to change a lot of things, because within the profile of a, let's say, sourcing agent, and you end up having e-filing and you've got a tax profile, because now you might be actually even considered to be within the trading space, you might actually end up meeting the professional taxpayer, where you are required to be a professional taxpayer. Well, some of them might actually end up not even be aware that actually they are professional taxpayers for that matter. So next thing, you find yourself actually being non-compliant because you did not submit professional tax returns. So I think for me, it's about your sourcing agent going out there and also doing more of education, basic education, and say, what does it mean for me to actually have that tax clearance and make sure that actually I'm compliant? And it's quite easy. Just register on e-filing. You can do this by yourself. Register on e-filing, easy to use, and then you can actually on a regular basis virtually see if you're actually still compliant based on your tax products that you will actually be listed under your profile. And in that case, if you're more compliant, then you should have your certificate and be able to trade.
Okay. No, that's brilliant. And I mean, maybe just on a closing note, I do, and we discussed this previously, I do feel that the tax certificate, for example, is a bit strict. I do worry, for instance, of situations where a person has valid disputes with SARS, or has made payment arrangements with SARS or the like. So I do worry about this particular provision and its effect on restraining people from practicing their trade. But that is a conversation for another day.
Fantastic. Wow, guys, that was a lot. That was a lot to just digest, and to also say thank you so much. You guys will be joining us again with the Q&A panel discussion. Also to piggyback, I beg your pardon, off of that, ladies and gentlemen, I just got word that on Monday on our coffee chat, the CEO of the Estate Agencies Affairs Board will be joining Andrew and Jade for our coffee chat. So if you want more in-depth questions, or you want a more in-depth understanding, please join us on our Facebook page, on our Facebook group, and our YouTube channel. You can ask the CEO, guys, the CEO of the State Agencies Affairs Board, the questions that maybe you could not ask or have a more detailed answer tonight. So as we move right along ever so swiftly, next up we have Bonga Nkulu from Tough.